You look weary. Come closer. I am the teller. Tales of wonder. Tales of light and dark. There are all manner of stories here. So come, sit by the fire. Let me tell you a story. Welcome. Around the fire, two more tales are born. The first, a tale from our own world, as we shift back into our usual patterns and practices. A young woman will face the fear and paranoia of what it means to be in the new normal. May I present Tracked and Traced.
Anna couldn't get the song out of her head as she bounded down the street. Freedom by George Michael. The bouncy keys of the piano line reverberated around her head and pulsed down the highway of her spine into her feet. It was carrying her, buoying her. She had been looking forward to this for a long time. 3 months to be exact. Pre-lockdown, Anna had been a serial party fiend. Every Friday post-shift drinks with the rest of the sales team down the Crown and Goose, followed by dinner and cocktails at a restaurant. Then Saturdays was spoons for pre-drinks with the gang, and then a club crawl through the city centre. Lockdown had put a swift end to that. Sure, she and her friends had tried to make it work like every other social butterfly across the country that was now caged in their own homes. She did the Zoom quizzes and the across-the-front garden wall chats. But now the time had arrived. It was July 4th weekend. Freedom weekend, as it was deigned by the government. And by God, Anna was hungry for her freedom. When the announcement that the restrictions were going to be lifted, her group chat had exploded with fevered conversation and planning. Who was coming out? Where would they go? Just a pub? Or dinner too? They all had their reservations, of course. The world was still in the clutches of the pandemic. And they weren't fools. They would wear masks, bring hand sanitizer, social distance and everything else to keep themselves and others safe. But they wanted to get drunk, and not staring into the bright light of their laptop or phone screens drunk, while shouting out the answer to Kelly's 4th Marvel movie quiz. So as Anna made her way down Hawthorne Road, George Michael's voice ringing through her ears, she was pumped, psyched, excited and ecstatic about her freedom. As she rounded the corner, she saw the queue for the pub. But even the strange sight of this new process of entering it didn't belay her spirits, because at the head of the queue, waving, shouting, and whooping in delight, were her friends. Kelly, Sharon, Maisie, Dylan, and Dom. Despite the masks clutched around their faces, she could see their wide smiles beneath as she rushed to them. She hugged each and every one of them, despite the tuts and disapproval from strangers in the queue, and worried looks through the windows of the pub. She didn't care though. This was the first time they had all been together in over 3 months. A single hug for each of her chosen family was worth the risk as far as she was concerned. The group all chatted and caught up as they waited to be allowed entrance to their hallowed halls of socially acceptable debauchery and hedonism. Dom had gotten engaged. Kelly had become a gluten-free baking queen. Sharon and Maisie had gotten heavily into books and were now a duo book club. Dylan had beaten his record for most joints smoked in a day. As Anna stood and talked and smoked and laughed with her friends, the familiar sense of camaraderie and community washed over her, temporarily erasing the paranoia, fear, and creeping sense of dread that had enveloped her over the past 3 months. And then they were allowed in. A masked and visor-wearing hostess guided their group to a table and informed them of the new processes put in place. They had to order from the designated pub app. No one could approach the bar, and if they had to move around the pub, follow the one-way system, leaving the mandated 2-meter gap between themselves and any other people. Someone will be along shortly to take their details for the track and trace scheme. If an outbreak was reported to the pub, they could then contact everyone who was present on that day so that they could be tested and self-isolate if need be. It was all professional, orderly, well-constructed, and made Anna and her friends feel comfortable. As they all logged into the app and ordered their pints, wines, cocktails, shots and bombs, another mask-clad and visor-strapped barman approached. He was of average height and build, and stopped at the head of the table. "Hey guys, so I just need to take some details for the track and trace program. Now we only need one of you to offer them up, since I assume you're all close enough to tell each other if you're unfortunately contacted due to an outbreak," he said, looking at each member of the group every few seconds. The table was silent as they all looked around at each other, no one willing to divulge their personal information. The barman, noticing their hesitation, threw his hands up in a way that was meant to seem comforting and playful, but came across jagged and aggressive. "We only keep the information for 2 weeks, and we won't contact you if there's been no reports of any cases in the building. I can promise you that." The table remained silent. The barman looked across their faces and stopped at Anna's. "How about you? Just a name and number?" Anna sighed. "Sure. It's Anna, and the number is 07847 635 421. The barman scribbled down the number and looked back at Anna. "Anna? That's a really nice name. Is your last name as nice?" Anna creased her face as she adjusted her face mask. "Do you need the last name as well?" The barman laughed loudly and suddenly. No. Was just curious, is all." The group giggled slightly, attempting to hide their laughter at the barman's boldness. The barman clapped his free hand to the pad of paper in the other. "Well, that's everything. Enjoy your freedom weekend, guys." "Bye, Anna," he half whispered as he turned and walked away. Anna turned back to their group as they all allowed their suppressed laughter to spill out. "Someone's got an admirer, eh?" Dylan snorted as he flicked a lighter on and off. Anna laughed. "Thank fuck for 2 meters, huh?" As the group dissolved into laughter once more, a mask-clad and visor-strapped barman approached with a large tray of drinks. And thus, the night began. It started uneasily at first, despite their best attempts. The group pulled their masks down, but not off, to drink. But as their glasses emptied and the hours slipped by, their careful and considered adherence to the rules and guidelines began to fade. As the pub became busier, masks were removed so they could hear each other over the rabble. Then, as they went for cigarette breaks in the garden, they remained off and were eventually left on their table or in their bags. The distance between each of them started off great, but with every whispered conversation about secret messages over lockdown and group selfies and shared cigarettes, the gap was closed. It wasn't that they were willfully disregarding the safety measures put in place. The group of friends had just been away from each other for so long, they almost couldn't control their pull to one another. Absence makes the heart grow fonder, as they say. Their gravitational pull to be close to one another was merely heightened by months-long separation and increased alcohol consumption. By the time 11 p.m. rolled around, the entire pub that had started off as a carefully planned and rule-respected establishment could no longer be separated from its usual pre-lockdown mayhem and intimacy. Anna didn't care though. After the second bottle of wine, third Jaeger bomb, and sixth tequila shot, she just wanted to hug Kelly, share a joint on the walk home with Dylan, and kiss the shit out of Sharon. She did all three. As she laid sprawled, half-dressed on her bed some hours later, Anna, fuzzy with booze-addled warmth and spent desire, she came to the conclusion that she had had one of the best nights out in her life. Was it the distance between her last one and this one? Was it the potent combination of drinks? The laughter that had left her cheeks hurting? The way Sharon had bitten her neck and promised to come over next time when they weren't so drunk and Dylan wasn't in need of carrying home? She didn't know. What she did know was that she hadn't thought about the virus in over 8 hours. And after all these months of sleepless nights and worried trips to Tesco, that was enough. Over the course of the next few days, Anna began preparations to return to work. She had been working from home throughout lockdown, but after the so-called Freedom Weekend, Mary, her supervisor, had sent out a company-wide email stating, "If you can drink a pint, you can make sales from the office." So Anna would return to the office in a week's time. She wasn't too upset, to be honest. She had actually missed the office over lockdown. The banter, the morning commute, the cheeky stop-out lunches with Steve from accounting. So as she was sat in her home office and began setting out her tasks for her return, she felt a growing sense of elation. Maybe things were returning to normal. On her desk in front of her, her phone vibrated. She looked at it. Unknown number. She never picked up unknown numbers. She didn't have time for the automated robot voice of Sheila from Compot Insurance about the fictitious accident she was in last week. She rejected the call and turned back to her computer. Her phone vibrated again. Unknown number. Persistent. She could give them that. Again, Anna rejected the call. This time, she waited for the call to return. Nothing happened. Anna smiled. The victor in this war. Then another vibration. A short one, this time, indicating a text. Anna picked up her phone and her stomach dropped. The message on her phone screen read, "Attention, track and trace alert. Location, the Crown and Goose. Date, 4th of the 7th, 2020. Phone call authentication required." Anna dropped her phone onto the desk and leaned back in her chair, the old metal of the frame squeaking and wailing in protest. She suddenly felt quite cold. So that was that, wasn't it? All it takes. One night out with everyone. Drinks and cigs and conversation. After months of isolation, ducking and diving in crowded shop aisles, crossing the road when someone was walking towards her, foregoing the socially distant yoga classes Tara had arranged. All it took was fucking Freedom Weekend. Surely it couldn't be. Anna stood up from her desk and went into the bathroom. She washed her hands with hot water, decanting the bottle of antibac soap onto her hands. She scrubbed and scrubbed as she looked into the overhead mirror. Was she pale? She did feel cold. Normally that's the first sign she's ill and a fever is on the way. But the window is open and there's a bit of a breeze. It could be that. There was so many people in the pub. The water was scorching her hands now, so she stopped washing. She went back into the office and grabbed her phone and reread the message. Attention, track and trace alert. Location, the Crown and Goose. Date, the 4th of the 7th, 2020. Christ. She needed a cigarette. She went down the stairs and grabbed her fags and lighter from the kitchen side and opened the back door. She lit the cigarette and held it in front of her. Should she be smoking this? They say smokers are adversely affected by the virus. Maybe she should give up. Fuck it. Too stressed. She took a long inhale and stared at the lighter in her hand. Was this hers? Or did she pick it up at the weekend by mistake? Was it Dylan's? Or was it some randos who had offered it in the smoking area? She tossed it in the bin. She would just use the hob from that one, until she next went to the shop anyway. Christ. If she had to self-isolate, she wouldn't be able to go to the shops. She couldn't even ask her mum to come over. She was still shielding. What could it have been? They never went to the bar, but they did take their masks off, and the toilet queue was never more than 2 meters between. The table was below the aircon, which started blowing around 9. Was it circulating infected air around them? Dylan's joint that was passed around? No, she would have heard from Dylan or one of the others, surely. Anna's phone vibrated. She pulled it out of her pocket. It was the unknown number. She took a deep breath and answered the phone. Yes? Hello? Anna said, trying to disguise the shaking in her voice. The line remained silent for a moment, Anna filling it with every possible utterance that could appear in her mind. Hello, is that Anna? a man's voice said. Yes, this is Anna, Anna replied.
This is Grant from the Crown and Goose. You may remember me from the weekend you were in with your friends. I took your details for the track and trace.
Anna took a quick drag from her barely lit cigarette. Yes, I got your text. What's the problem? Was there a case? No response came from Grant for a moment until he said,
No, actually everything's been fine here. I hope this isn't too forward, but I just wanted to get in contact with you. I think you're really pretty. One of the prettiest girls I've ever met, actually. So I thought I'd just give you a call so we could, connect, maybe.
Anna took a deep breath as she took in this information. Sorry, just say that again. There isn't an issue. There's been no cases at the Crown. Is that what you're saying? Grant laughed nervously over the line.
No, none that I'm aware of, anyway. I know it's a bit weird and maybe over the line even, but you got to be bold these days, don't you?
Anna took a puff on her cigarette and flicked it out at the back door.
So, any chance you'd want to grab a coffee or something stronger, maybe?
Grant said. Anna looked at her phone and brought up the text message. She had thought something was weird about it. There it was. Attention was spelt with one T.
Hello? Hello, Anna?
Grant's tinny, distant voice warbled from the phone in her hand. Anna brought it back up to her ear. No thanks, mate. I'd rather catch the virus.
Our second tale comes from a world much like our own, but further down the road. What will a man do when faced with the demise of his own community? And what will he sacrifice to keep it alive? May I present One More Day.
It was the eyes that broke him. Those faded, glassy eyes that stared at him over the weak light from the campfire. There were 10 pairs in total. There used to be more. Christ, there had been so many at one point. But now there were 10. Only 10 remaining pairs of eyes that watched him, implored to him, begged to him wordlessly. Those eyes were harboured by a motley collection of survivors and the inhabitants of their camp. When society fell and community became a word of the past, most resorted to brutal tribalism and savagery against anyone that wasn't blood. He was the same for a time. After that pack of beasts took his daughter and his wife that foggy night 5 years ago. They had been resting, in so much you could call it rest, by the side of a lake. His daughter, Molly, had said it looked pretty. She had always liked pretty things, gentle things, calm surfaces, and smooth textures. They held her under the surface until it returned to its earlier calm whilst he was beaten. He never saw what they did to his wife, but he heard. After that he became much like them. Starting with their blood, he spilt much more over the following 2 years. Men, women, but never children. He often thought that this delineation had somehow made him better than the ones who had severed his family from this world. It wasn't until he was stood over the felled and bloody corpse of a man who had had a car full of tinned goods and bottled water that he realized he was just as wretched as the rest. It wasn't the broken body of the desperate man that caused the realization. It was minutes later when he opened the passenger side door to see the man's wife had snuffed out her own child's breath with a pillow and slit her own throat. Mercy. Mercy. He wandered for days after that moment. He took no supplies. He buried the family together, also by a still lake, much like the one where his family was resting. He had decided upon starvation and dehydration as his rightful end. Suffering. Suffering absolute was the only fitting punishment for him. He walked and stumbled for days that turned to nights that turned to days until his legs could no longer carry him. As he fell, his body drained, his soul and spirit depleted. He waited for the passing. Instead, he awoke 2 days later surrounded by those eyes. Back then they were stronger, sharp with colour, purpose, will. They brought him back from the brink, nursing him from a hollow shell of a man into someone with purpose once more. A pillar in a structure, a tool on a belt, a man in a community. They resided at the foot of a great mountain, high enough away from the desolation and cruelty of once populated cities and towns, but flanked on all sides by vast woods, streams and lakes. They were a hearty people who had not allowed the descent of the world to bring them down with it. It was through these people, these eyes, that he had once again found a reason to live, a reason to hope, survive, and even prosper. For it was in these eyes that he saw himself. Over the ensuing 2 years he worked and grew and lived alongside these people and these eyes. They built and refined their camp. Trees were felled to construct simple yet sturdy log cabins, lined with leaves for warmth and fortified with sticks for stability. They hunted, gathered, fished, and for some time they lived almost as well as the time before the fall. But as the days, weeks, and months passed, things began to change. The weather became increasingly hostile. What was once a mild and temperate environment year-round became wild and untamable. Great winds and ceaseless, endless rain lashed down on them and their homes, turning their shelters into cracked and jagged memories of comfort, and tearing up the carefully constructed pathways into slurries of untraversable mud and sorrow. Lakes once wild with fish now bore no aquatic fruit. Forests once alive with the patter of feet on which to prey fell silent. Plants and bushes once harbouring fruits and roots on which to feast turned barren and poisonous. As their supplies dwindled, so did their numbers. Their camp of plenty began to lose numbers like minutes slipped by on a clock. Some fell to illness and sickness incurable. Some fled in search of more outside the confines of their once plentiful refuge. Some even turned on one another in anger and conflict born from the paranoia and fear that settles in the hearts of men as their stomachs and hearts go empty for too long. One morning they awoke to their de facto leader, a man of some years gone. He had flown in the night, like a spectral phantom leaving behind the idea of an organized and compassionate community, long since vanished from the world. It was at this moment he decided to step in. He would lead these people out of the darkness, retreat from the sorrow in which they were gripped, and march them to salvation. After all, they had done the same for him. He started by sacrificing the remaining horses the camp had. Their meat would feed the group for some weeks, their hides would provide material for warmth, and their fat would provide fuel. Then he began taking long trips out of the woods and into the surrounding towns, and which before held nothing. Stores and shops had laid wasted and empty for years, and residential properties housed almost nothing of worth outside of singular forgotten cans of beans or tuna. As his results continued to turn up fewer and fewer options, his desire only grew stronger. So that night, over the slowly dying fire, as those 10 final pairs of eyes watched him over meagre bowls of root soup, he decanted his own back into the communal pot and went back out into the wastes. He had to find something, anything. This community would not fall. It could not fall. He wandered all night. He overturned stones searching for insects. He searched holes and crevices for rodents. He climbed trees in search of eggs or birds. He swam through rivers and lakes armed with a small hunting knife in the hopes of finding fish. But the stones concealed nothing. The holes and crevices were barren and lifeless. The nests and trees held no life, gestating or otherwise. The lakes and rivers were still and empty. He pulled himself along with the fading energy afforded to him, until after some hours, as he stumbled into a clearing amongst the snow-covered trees, he saw something. A small child, a girl no older than 10, wandering through the snow. She wore a red jacket that matched her fiery red hair. She was a stark contrast to the endless void of white around her, a fire in a whiteout. For a moment he watched the young girl. She did not seem frightened, in search of absent family or friends. She seemed resilient, used to a life of solitude and foraging. She bent over a small patch of vegetation that emerged from the snow like a dull green beacon of possible sustenance. For a moment, he saw his own daughter in her small frame, a child, a human being at the start of her journey, yet carrying the years and experience of someone 20 years her senior. He could speak to her, reach out, bring her back to the camp. The newfound energy and presence of a young and fertile life could rejuvenate his fading community. Someone to raise, someone to care for, tend to, and watch over. Another mouth to feed. Another mouth to feed when there were so many left unfed and starving already. What could she offer outside of one more day? One more day. He returned to the camp that night. The eyes around the now dead fire watched him come from some distance away. They had long abandoned their watch posts and lookouts some months prior, now welcoming to interlopers and surprise visitors, rather than hostile and questioning. He stood out against the gentle swirl of the snow that surrounded him. Beside him, the young girl walked, clutched in her hand his knife. As they arrived, the eyes watched them as the pair sat down. He tended to the fire as the young girl ran the knife against the stone. The eyes watched as he removed his clothing and nodded to the young, fiery girl. The eyes watched as the steely-eyed girl took the knife and separated his flesh from his body, piece by piece, tossed it into the simmering, steaming pot above the fire. He made no sound, no objection, no resistance. They had given him everything, and now it was his turn. The eyes didn't ask questions. They just needed to eat, and they would tonight. But tomorrow would come, and the next day, and the next. What then? The eyes didn't know. They couldn't know. Perhaps this girl with the fiery hair would know, would show them. Maybe she would be next for the pot. They didn't talk. They just watched as he disappeared, ribbon by ribbon, chunk by chunk, into the pot. One more day. One more day.
And so, the fire dies. We will return in a fortnight, as we always do. Be sure to look up the rest of the Come Sit By the Fire, the short story podcast, tales. The fire continually burns on many platforms: SoundCloud, Stitcher, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube. Be sure to journey over to WORK.STORIES.REPEAT.com for more stories, articles, and essays. Fire also burns on social medias, the digital fireplace that is Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We'll see you again by the fire. Farewell.